hearing from the pros. I mean, clearly there's a reputational risk to having bribery discovered in your supply chain. What sort of risks are you seeing there? It could then flow into fines and unwelcome interactions with the law.
Everything.
Losing.
Yeah, Steve, it would impact everything. I think if you actually have a non-compliant event like that is of that magnitude, then where you're even thinking about fines, then you also have the costs of investigation, you have the costs of remediation, you have the reputational damage, you have the morale damage to the company, customers are impacted, suppliers are impacted, shareholders are impacted. It really is a systemic flu, if you like. Everything feels bad. So it is not a world of pain that anybody wants to step into. And the minute you're in a situation where a regulator is involved, then you're triggering all of that. But even if it doesn't reach that magnitude of having a regulator involved, when you have, as most companies now do, bylines that are inspirational about all the good that they're doing in the world, I can think of quite a few companies that have similar tags, right? I know we certainly do. We want to help the world run better and improve people's lives. When that is actually a part of the fabric of the company and something happens that challenges it, that will impact on people. That impacts on your employees and all of the employees, the 99.9% that are doing good, right? It impacts on everybody. And that is deeply problematic, yeah.
No, well said. So I think that's it, isn't it? So much just kind of gets lumped and diminished under the label of reputational risk when it's so much bigger than that. And as we've been talking about the way that the red flags and conversations between stakeholders, having a blot like corruption in your own supply chain could have really profound consequences on being able to secure business with others. So I think that really we want everybody to understand just how business critical this is. Okay, we're rapidly running out of time. There's another question here from Olivier. It's got a bit more of a nuance to it, but I'm not quite sure if we haven't answered it. So why don't we maybe just use this to wrap up? The question is, what are the primary challenges or obstacles that companies face when attempting to implement effective anti-corruption measures across their supply chains, and how can these challenges be addressed? So why don't we, if you have something that you think we haven't said already about challenges, but equally, if there was something else that you prepared and you thought you might want to say during this webinar and we just didn't get there, now is your chance. So why don't we go in the order we started? So Maeve, you can kick us off.
Great, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure this is necessarily a new point, but I think just good to kind of reiterate once again, kind of this question triggered that in my memory, is just, I think one of the biggest challenges, and Bahare spoke to it really eloquently, is just that disconnect between the policies and procedures, the people kind of in head office, if you like, setting those policies, and those people on the ground who are really operationalizing your supply chain. And I think, yeah, if there's kind of one issue of real focus, I think it's trying to kind of bridge that gap between policy and practice, make sure that those people on the ground are empowered to kind of act to the standards that you're setting.
Muted. And Viviane.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Maeve. I think with all of these things to do with the broader compliance topics, it's about buy-in. You've got to have buy-in from your leadership. You have to have buy-in from the mid-level. You've got to get the entire company talking about compliance and feeling it as a second skin. This is not something that you do, it's something that you are. It just becomes normal business as usual, and that's critical. If you can get to that threshold, everything else becomes much easier, essentially. And that's got to be the aim, I think. Certainly, it's not necessarily an easy route, but building that engagement, getting people to understand why it's important, taking it beyond the question of a fine, but into something which is really personal. This is our legacy. You know, when you're Googled, when your company name is looked up, what are you going to see? What are the headlines? If you have personal ownership of that, if you've got skin in the game because you're proud of what you do and you want others to be proud of what you do, then having that as a culture of compliance will make everything else run more smoothly.
That legacy point is, I recently introduced to a website called the Violations Tracker, and it shows every fine every company has ever paid in any jurisdiction. It doesn't go away. So yes,
go away.
Be avoided. Bahari, over to you.
I think there's a couple of things. I completely agree with everything that Maeve and Vivian said. I think one is really understanding where the risks lie in your business, really understanding it, understanding what you're really, really concerned about and what you're not, so that you can focus your efforts in the right places is fundamental. And that's not just about supply chains, that's about your ABC program across the board. And as I said, all of that needs to be interconnected. And then I think ultimately for me, and this again applies to all my compliance relevant risks, it's about ownership and accountability. You need to have someone, ideally, not just a board, but a person that is responsible for driving it forward, that is responsible for providing updates, that is going to be accountable if something goes wrong. And I think sometimes that's not very clear and it sort of sits in one bucket or not the other. And without that clarity around ownership and accountability of the program, I don't think you're ever going to be able to drive it forward in the way that you want.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. It's been a really interesting conversation, a pleasure speaking with you. I have to be very brief now because our next session is starting in just 9 minutes, probably 8 by the time I'm done. We're going to be picking up many of these same themes as we look at building supply chain resilience through supplier engagement. So how can you get those relationships with suppliers so that you can address your anti-corruption due diligence along with other really important issues. So again, thank you so much, Maeve, Vivian, and Bahari. Thank you to our audience for the fabulous questions and engagement in the chat. Most appreciated. We'll see you back again, I hope, in 9 minutes for the next session in the summit. Thanks and bye.
Thank you very much.
You sticking with us. If you've just joined, I'm going to just quickly run through some housekeeping while we wait for others to come on. Closed captioning is turned on. There's a button at the bottom of your screen if you need to see subtitles. We are in webinar mode, and that means our audience will be muted throughout, and not able to turn on cameras. But of course, as I've said, been saying all day, we really want to hear from you, and we really appreciate your active participation in the session. There's 2 ways that you can engage: through the chat box. There's a button at the bottom of your screen to open that up. And please take advantage of the chat box to say hello, to share your LinkedIn profile, make some new connections. If you want to comment on what you're hearing, that's the place to do it. And if you're having any technical difficulties, then likewise, please do let us know through there so that we can help to fix them. In the spirit of that, I'm just popping my own LinkedIn connection in there. I'm happy to connect with you there. Now, if you want to ask a question to our fantastic speakers, the place to do that is through the Q&A function. And there again, there's a button at the bottom of your screen. If you open that up, you can ask your questions there. But just asking questions isn't all. We want everyone, whether you have questions or not, to keep an eye on the Q&A box. And if you see a question that you're really interested in having an answer to, then do click on the thumbs up. Your votes will elevate that question and improve the likelihood that we'll be able to answer it. All day long, we've been getting way more questions than we've been able to answer. That's likely to be the case again with this panel. So your help in prioritizing the questions ensures that we're talking about the issues that you care about the most. Okay, I think that takes care of the... And finally, of course, the session is being recorded, and we will be sharing the recording along with some key takeaways just as soon as we can get it all organized after the event. So probably sometime next week, but maybe we'll surprise you. Okay, so as I said, welcome back. This is the penultimate session of the day, and we are aiming to answer the question, how can business engage and collaborate with suppliers on key sustainability challenges to enhance supply chain resilience? As I've been saying all day, again, a big part of our mission is to drive business engagement on the SDGs. We see this session as being particularly relevant to Goal 8 on decent work and economic growth, Goal 12 on responsible consumption and production, and Goal 13 on climate action. But of course, as I've been saying again, the goals are so interconnected that action on supplier engagement around these issues is going to have knock-on effects to all of the goals. And Goal 17 is going to be particularly important in achieving our aims in this. Okay, and so now, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to our moderator for this session, Maggie Berry, the Director of Heart of the City, and she will introduce our speakers and get us started on this conversation. Maggie, over to you.
Steve, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth session of day 2 of the UN Global Compact Network UK's annual summit. Thank you so much for joining this virtual session, which, as Steve explained, is focused on how businesses can both engage and collaborate with their suppliers on key sustainability challenges to both enhance supply chain resilience and to keep us delivering sustainability commitments. Linking these two aspects is a business priority that is growing in importance. And from today's session, we're aiming to share some really useful and practical insight for you all. By way of a short introduction, my name is Maggie Berry. I lead a responsible business charity called Heart of the City, and we support SMEs, small and medium-sized businesses, those businesses with up to 250 staff, with all things related to sustainability and ESG. And for those of you who joined the in-person event yesterday, the in-person summit, we're based right on Guildhall Yard, so you would have walked past our office front door. I've led the charity for just over 2 years, but it actually has over 20 years experience in helping businesses to be a force for good. And our training programs and free resources for SMEs provide small businesses with all the building blocks we believe they need in place to run a sustainable business, whether it's looking at equity, diversity, inclusion, mental health and well-being, social justice, net zero. We're really helping small businesses to take action so they will remain or have the opportunity to compete to be a supplier of choice to both the public and private sector, who are increasingly looking for suppliers who can demonstrate their sustainability credentials. And indeed, we're increasingly working with large businesses who want to provide support to their wider supply chain with all things linked to sustainability. On a personal note, I've worked in the supply chain support space since 2012, and I've worked with many large corporates and with many SMEs on supplier inclusion initiatives. It's another aspect of supply chain resilience, and it's all about encouraging larger firms to buy more products and services from diverse-owned businesses. Now, this is a firmly embedded topic, part of supply chain programs in the US, and it's a topic that saw an increase in focus here in Europe during COVID, as many big businesses realize that actually having access to a more diverse range of suppliers, often based more locally, can respond in a more agile way and provide more supply chain resilience. We're seeing more and more examples of businesses engaging and collaborating with suppliers to ensure sustainability agendas are really aligned across the supply chain and the wider business. And engaging effectively with supplier stakeholders really helps organizations to build those stronger, more transparent and more valuable relationships with their extended ecosystem, kind of reaching through to tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, many of whom might be SMEs. And I know, so like, why is that important? SMEs are really fundamental to the UK's economic performance. They're engines of growth, they're drivers of innovation and adaptability and creativity. They're creating jobs, generating prosperity, but they're also essential to levelling up communities and in reaching net zero. And we want them to fully contribute to reaching the UK sustainability goals, and indeed the sustainability goals that larger corporates might have as well. But these remain really unprecedentedly tough trading conditions for all businesses. And so SMEs are going to need support if entire value chains are going to be transformed. You'll probably know this, 99% of businesses in the UK are SMEs. So most people in the UK work for a small business. And we really need to harness their collective impact as we tackle the sustainability challenges that are facing business today. Now, today's session is not all about SMEs, but they do play a big part. So I will just say, if you're planning to take steps in this place, please do consider your smallest suppliers too. As you'll hear today, there'll be lots of elements of testing involved, like a fully formed supplier engagement strategy will probably take several iterations, might involve pilots with different groups to understand what really works for your working environment, as well as the different geographies that you're operating in, and to understand and ascertain what support might be needed. It's probably not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach, and businesses are all at different stages of the journey. So indeed, say amongst your bigger suppliers, are there businesses there who already have really robust ESG programs, they're up and running, and they could share insight and advice and really inspire others of your suppliers to take action? And don't forget to look at some of those smaller suppliers who might have some really brilliant best practices to share as well. So exploring the ways that businesses can create supplier engagement strategies that work for both their big and their small suppliers, that are going to be mutually beneficial for all parties, and which really support supply chain resilience and sustainable development more broadly. That's really what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And to help bring these points to life, I'm joined by two fantastic speakers who are going to share an insight into two different aspects of sustainability. Matteo Squire, he's the Global Sustainability Manager at Unilever. He's going to be talking to us about encouraging suppliers to pay the living wage. And Bobby Mellor, who's Global Head of Sustainability and Transparency at Vodafone. She's going to be talking to us about their work supporting suppliers in reducing their Scope 3 emissions. There is lots of time for questions. And so once we've heard from both Matteo and Bobby, and as Steve said, please do use the chat, the Q&A function to post your queries. We'd really like to be able to answer the questions from those of you who are listening in today, and make sure that we're really helping you to answer the challenges that you're facing. So Matteo and Bobby, thank you so much in advance for speaking for us today. Matteo, I'm going to come to you first and ask you to present. And I'm going to say, Matteo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Maggie. Brilliant. Well, so today I'm representing Unilever. As Maggie mentioned, I'm a Global Sustainability Manager here, part of the Global Sustainability team. So my role is really focused around our advocacy, partnerships, and global kind of strategy specifically on living wage and living income. So delighted to be here to talk to you a little bit about how we approach the issue and how we work with suppliers on this. Next slide, please. I guess maybe just to begin, because I know with living wage, the definition can be something that is not, globally agreed on. So I think that the definition that is often used is the one by, am I breaking up? I see a comment in the chat. The definition that we use is the Global Living Wage Coalition definition, which says that the remuneration received for a standard work week by a worker in a particular time and place is sufficient essentially to afford a decent standard of living. And that would include food, water, housing, education, healthcare, transport, clothing, and other essential needs. So really trying to make sure that people can afford enough to live a decent standard of living for themselves and their family. I guess in terms of the context, we know that inequality is one of the biggest challenges facing our society today. And that's alongside, obviously, climate change and nature and biodiversity loss. The ILO has said about 1 billion working people, or 1 in 3 working people, afford less than they need. And in May 2022, the Business Commission to Tackle Inequality launched a report, which is the first of its kind, I think, that really brought together the social agenda for business. Living wage was mentioned as one of the most effective ways to tackle inequality, as it directly addresses issues around, for those at the bottom of the pyramid. And finally, I guess on the wider context, we recognize that business models relying on poverty wages are incompatible with the fundamentals of respecting human rights. Next slide, please. So I guess in terms of the why, I think there's a few points here. The first, of course, is the moral imperative. Living wage, as I mentioned, is a human right, and any model, any business that takes sustainability or that is kind of purpose-led, as Unilever is, simply cannot rely on poverty wages, both in their own operations or within their supply chains. Now, there's also a business case, and we're seeing that kind of come up more and more in terms of the commercial benefits. We had commissioned some research with Business Fights Poverty, Cambridge, and Shift, which looked at a few of these. So we saw increased worker productivity and reduced turnover. We saw that it created more resilient value chains, as we saw less industrial action and other issues in the supply chain. And then we saw that it also grows consumer markets. And for example, especially for a company like Unilever, which sells basic goods, the share of people that can then afford basic goods such as food increases, so that the benefit there is relatively clear. In terms of the economic case, we know that it can boost global GDP by about $4.5 trillion every year through increased productivity and spend. And finally, as Steve mentioned at the beginning, we also know that there's knock-on effects. So not just thinking about the impact on decent work, of course, which is one of the areas it falls under, but obviously inequality, but also thinking about climate action. If those, we know that if people are not enfranchised, they will not be able to help us achieve a world where we are at 1.5 degrees. And so there's knock-on effects on several of the SDGs. Next slide, please. And then I guess just to present some of the wider context from a movement perspective, the ILO, which is the International Labour Organization, so the UN kind of entity focused on labor, has for the first time in 2022, I think, called out living wage and called for assistance to member states on living wage. And they are obviously one of the UN entities which is kind of accepted in 150 plus countries, so their impact is huge. And they've been increasingly looking for, how they can try and advance this issue within countries, getting minimum wage to be closer to a living wage and bringing a globally aligned definition, bring some clarity in terms of the methodologies for calculating it. So they are kind of moving forward in this respect. We've also seen increased legislation from an EU perspective, particularly where companies will be asked to report on it as part of due diligence legislation. And we have some few front-runner countries trying to advance this issue both within the EU, but also beyond. Then investors are also adding pressure. Share Action, for example, is an investor group with representing several £1 trillion worth of kind of assets, had recently filed a living wage resolution, essentially asking a retailer in the UK to pay a living wage to their own employees. And Platform Living Wage Financials is another kind of investor group focusing on the issue. And finally, Rankings and Ratings are increasingly asking Unilever for their strategy on living wage, how are they closing gaps, etc. So really, I guess what the last two slides try and present, a little bit of that kind of the why, the context in terms of how is the movement building. Next slide, please. On to Unilever. So in 2021, we launched our Compass strategy, which outlined, I guess, it's an integrated business and sustainability strategy. As part of this, we had actually launched a commitment in 2014 to pay a living wage to our own employees. And we achieved that in 2020. So when we launched this new sustainability strategy, we decided to try and increase our ambition. And you can see here the purple text on the right there, which states that we want to ensure that everyone who directly provides goods and services to Unilever will earn at least a living wage or income by 2030. Maybe just a bit as well on this. I think the first idea was that we wanted to build a bit of credibility. So we wanted to make sure our own house was in order. And that's why, we wanted to make sure first we achieve the target within our own operations before we go and ask suppliers to move forward on this issue as well. So that's what we kind of did. We developed a framework for fair compensation, which outlined our approach and how we would go about it. In the first year, we found that within our own operations, about 12,000 employees fell below a living wage. So that's about 8% of our workforce. And it took a long time. I think it took about 6 years for us to close the gaps with those 12,000 employees. And so we recognized that with the target that we launched in 2021, we needed to have a 10-year kind of phased approach and work really with suppliers towards that kind of 10-year target. Next slide, please. So in terms of the approach that we have, as I said, we have a 10-year phased approach, and we focus on those markets where the gap between legal minimum wage and living wage is the biggest, the social safety net is the weakest, and we have leverage through our spend. And you can see the markets listed there. But we also work looking at different portfolios. So for example, we want to start with collaborative manufacturing and contingent workforce, often because these are the ones that are really closest to our business and where we have kind of employees working side by side, or where some are kind of dedicated suppliers. We have leverage on those kind of suppliers. So starting with, I guess, an inner core approach and working our way outwards throughout the 10 years as we go on. And the next slide will touch on how we kind of leverage advocacy to do so. Sorry, could we go back to the other slide? In terms of the supplier collaboration, I just wanted to point out the 3 buckets. So there's a few ways that we work with suppliers. The first is the Living Wage Partner Promise, which is essentially a tool that we use. We ask our suppliers to join us in this journey, to work together on addressing key challenges that we face. And we essentially ask them to, commit to paying a living wage in their own operations, and to consider also releasing that commitment publicly, because we know that it adds to, it builds that kind of pressure. If we have more companies asking, or more suppliers asking for a living wage in their own operations, we can get to a critical mass. The second is the responsible partner policy. So that's a policy that all our suppliers have to sign up to do business with Unilever. And one of the requirements as part of that is that, and it's a future mandatory requirement, is that living wage is paid for all their employees. So there's a kind of pull and a push. And the last piece is really around capability building. So working with some of our suppliers, starting with our key suppliers, and working on, how we can do this in a way that, leveraging, I guess, the learnings that we had from closing gaps in our own operations, how we can work together to close gaps in their operations. We do also just even the basics, understanding what is a living wage, what are the tools that are out there, what's the data, etc. So really trying to work closely with our suppliers to advance the issue. Next slide, please. And then, as I mentioned, there's a big piece around advocacy and the need for advocacy. So we know that if Unilever is the only one asking this, there is a risk that our suppliers can be at a competitive disadvantage, which is why having a level playing field is so crucial. And we also know that as we get further and further out of our inner core, so towards our outer core, our influence is lower. So realistically, being able to get suppliers to commit to a living wage gets harder and harder as the further down we go. So accelerating other companies' living wage commitments has been a crucial part of our strategy. We are part of several business coalitions, and this is also why we supported UN Global Compact's Forward Faster on living wage. And our CEO also promoted it at the SDG Summit just this September in New York, trying to get others as well to sign up. In terms of the enabling environment, we know one of the biggest issues on living wage is around data. So, you know, what is the actual living wage rate in a certain region? There's a couple issues. One is accessibility. So suppliers currently need to pay a benchmark to access the data. And the second is on credibility. So in terms of accessibility, we, along with 8 other companies, have funded one of these benchmarks to go public, so Wage Indicator, with their data. So we hope that by the end of this year, all our suppliers, but also anyone else, will be able to access this data for free. And that will be another way that we build kind of critical mass. The third is around building that business imperative. So I mentioned a little bit the research that we did, but we're also looking at impact studies, trying to show the benefits to workers, business, and the economy. And the fourth is engagement with governments, essentially. So trying to increase minimum wage towards living wages in certain key countries. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up my presentation, I guess the key takeaways I had was living wage is a must, not only from a human impact perspective, but also from a business perspective. We know that a focus on own operations is a good starting point, and it's a way to build credibility, but that building that within the supply chain is even more crucial. It's where most of the issues lie in terms of low wage workers. And the third is that, you know, there is a big need for further collaboration, whether that be with, you know, working with suppliers to help develop solutions, but also working with other companies, peers, investors, trade unions, and governments to try and, you know, address this issue from different angles and address some of those big barriers that we know are still there. And to make sure that companies are incentivized to, you know, make this positive change, I guess, and that we have that level playing field, which makes sure that our suppliers and other companies, you know, are not at risk of being at a competitive disadvantage while trying to advance an issue which is on the, you know, on the kind of global agenda. So I guess those are the kind of 3 key things I had in mind. And Maggie, I'll pass it back Maggie, I'll pass it back to you.
Matteo, thank you so much. I've got plenty of questions of my own, but that it's definitely, and I can see things that are already coming through to Q&A. So everybody hang fire on those, please keep putting them in there, and Matteo will come to them at the end after we've heard from Bobby. And as I said, Bobby is the Global Head of Sustainability and Transparency at Vodafone. And Bobby, the floor is yours. You're going to be talking to us about the work that you're doing to support suppliers in reducing their Scope 3 emissions. And that was one of the first questions in the Q&A, was all about net zero. So this is beautifully aligned. So Bobby, over to you. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Maggie. And I promise I didn't plant that one. It is just a really important topic. So hi, everyone. Absolutely great to be here. As Maggie said, my name is Bobby. I'm the Head of Sustainability for Vodafone Group. So for those of you that may not know Vodafone, we are a multinational telecom company working primarily across Europe and Africa, probably best known to you for these things, your phones, but we also provide infrastructure services connecting the world to the internet, and also IoT and B2B connectivity. So we want to try and start to get to grips with Scope 3 emissions in our upstream supply chain in this short session where I'll be talking to you, and just highlight some of the levers that we're using to bring our suppliers along with us on their decarbonisation journey. So just as a quick refresh, and for anyone who's not familiar with Scope 3, Scope 3 emissions are the greenhouse gas emissions that are generated from activities within both upstream and downstream value chains. We will look mostly upstream in this session first, and they're the emissions that businesses are sort of indirectly responsible for, because those value chain activities are necessary to enable a business to or enable a business model. So at Vodafone, we've set science-based targets to reduce our Scope 3 emissions as well as our Scope 1 and 2 emissions. We aim to halve our Scope 3 emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions across our whole value chain, so Scope 1, 2 and 3 by 2040. And those are global targets. So Scope 3 is really important for us at Vodafone. We're not a hugely emitting or heavy emitting industry in telecom, and about 91% of our emissions sit within our Scope 3 footprint. So that's why we're putting so much focus on this area. The biggest source of that 91% of emissions are the goods and services that we buy from our suppliers. Almost half of our Scope 3 footprint comes from those. So that's things like the mobile devices that we eventually sell on to our customers, but also the network equipment that we build our infrastructure with, like the radio antennae or data servers, etc. So just to give you a bit of a picture of what our supply chain looks like before we get into the emission reduction initiatives, we work with about 9,000 direct suppliers within Vodafone Group, and we spend about 25 billion euros annually with those suppliers. And we've been engaging with our supply chain for a number of years around our purpose commitments and around climate specifically, and that engagement runs along the whole relationship, the duration of the relationship with suppliers. So at the point of RFP, so the moment where people are bidding for work, we allocated 20% weighting to what we call Vodafone purpose commitments, and that covers health and safety, diversity, inclusion, and planet. So concretely, companies that, for example, have science-based net zero targets will score better when we're assessing those who are bidding for our work. And we also work with our suppliers on key areas where that have a direct impact on our own Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So to give you an example, about 93% of our energy usage at Vodafone comes from running our networks. So energy efficiency is really, really important to us. So we will, for example, measure the energy efficiency per use of per unit of data when we're looking at supplier selection around network equipment. We also, like Matteo mentioned with Unilever, we expect all of our suppliers to sign a code of ethical purchasing and align with Vodafone's own code of conduct. So we have that engagement at the very first moment when we're talking to suppliers, and I think that sends a really strong message to them about Vodafone's purpose, values, and what we expect of our supplier when they sort of join the Vodafone value chain. But we ensure that is reiterated throughout the whole relationship. So we monitor progress against the purpose targets that we assessed in the RFP throughout supplier relationships. We provide training and education, and we reward positive developments or outcomes, for example, through our supplier awards. But we also implement consequences if suppliers aren't making progress in the right direction, or if they're slipping back on commitments. And that could be a reduction in business, or it could actually be a termination of contract. So as we're really focusing on reducing our Scope 3 emissions, we've really got to find these levers as to how we bring our suppliers along on their decarbonisation journey. And we're running a number of parallel work streams on this, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there is no silver bullet to decarbonise the supply chain. It's really hard, and I think as we all kind of go more deeper into our Scope 3 emissions, we're realising that there's more that we need to do, and just how difficult that will be. So first of all, to help us move away from a spend-based methodology and towards a supply-specific one, we have engaged our top 4 suppliers, which actually represent 38% of our purchase goods and service emissions. So we're quite concentrated in terms of where emissions come from. And we've asked them to improve their sharing of product carbon footprint data and come back to us with identified opportunities where they reduce their embedded carbon. So that's kind of the first thing where we're saying, okay, we've identified where the bulk of the emissions are coming from. We're realizing it's from these top 4, and we're having a very targeted engagement program with them. More broadly, this year we've launched a new pilot initiative with CDP and Citibank to actually incentivize improved climate performance amongst our supply chain. So this initiative essentially provides financial incentive for our suppliers to disclose carbon data to CDP and then take action to improve their CDP scoring over time. So in partnership with CDP, we've developed this framework which has 12 criteria from the CDP survey, which relates specifically to greenhouse gas emissions. So when the suppliers share their performance score against these 12 criteria, they have the opportunity to then receive a preferential financing rate based on their ranking. So the better their ranking is, the better the financing rates will be. So this has been launched initially for suppliers who are using Citibank's scheme already, but we're hoping that we can actually expand this across other telecom companies, but also CDP using this as a framework for supplier financing more broadly. So this is kind of it's quite a blunt tool. You know, it says to our suppliers, if you perform better on climate, you will get preferential financing rates. It will cost you less effectively to do business. So we're really excited to kind of monitor how that goes. It was just launched at the start of this financial year, and I'm very happy to talk to others about how you might want to adopt that model as well. The final thing I'll just highlight is how we actually work to embed climate commitments into our supplier contracts. So we've worked really closely with the Chancery Lane project for a number of years to embed their climate clauses into our contracts. Those clauses are all available online, so I'm going to put the link in once I finish chatting so everyone can see those. And this actually enshrines climate commitments into the legality of our contracts. And we actually have designed 2 different types of clauses, recognizing that a lot of what we've mentioned here is much more difficult for SMEs to achieve. So there's sort of a lighter touch obligation SME clause, and then one for larger corporates with more detailed and kind of onerous obligations tailored towards suppliers that have the capability to be able to adhere to those or have a very big carbon footprint. So I'll pause there and very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Bobby, thank you so much. I can see lots of questions for you, and people requesting more information. So I will come to that. But everyone, please do, if you've got questions, please do put them in the Q&A. I'm using if you vote for the questions, so I can see which questions most of the room are interested in. So please do use that. Matteo, Bobby, thank you very much both for sharing a bit of insight into two quite different aspects of sustainability, which we shared at the beginning. But Bobby, coming to you in this, you mentioned about kind of a lot of focus on that upstream piece. But what about the downstream value chain engagement? What's that looking like at Vodafone? For example, I don't know, SMEs, suppliers with the refurbished phone market or something, you know, along those kind of lines.
Yeah, brilliant question. About 11% of our Scope 3 emissions come from the use of our products. So effectively, when we're actually probably doing it right now. So we're using connectivity here. If anyone's on their phone on a Vodafone contract, we need to include those emissions in our reporting, and also of the phones themselves when they're produced. Now, I think and that also goes for things like TVs as well and routers and that sort of thing. it's quite a tricky area that we've just started to delve into, and I think compared to, I think on kind of circularity and e-waste in particular, we probably are where we were on carbon 5-10 years ago, but it's something we're really excited about at Vodafone, and also recognizing that we need to take action here. So we're working with partners and customers on trying to build more a circular economy for mobile handsets in particular. So we're focusing to begin with on how we can create a better market for refurbished phones and move our customers more towards buying refurbished phones or keeping their phones for longer. We know that the climate impact of a refurbished phone is 87% less than of a brand new phone. So it's an area where we can have a really huge impact. But if we're honest, we also know that a lot of telecom business models have been modeled around encouraging people to upgrade their phones, and a lot of consumers really want the latest phone. So we have started by working with WWF on a campaign called 1 Million Phones for Our Planet, and we're basically looking to kind of encourage everyone to go into that drawer at home where you've got sort of 7 old phones, and bring them into a Vodafone store, and when we take those old phones, we will wipe them of their data, and either work on a trade-in proposition with you, or make a donation to WWF. And the reason that we want to start collecting those old phones is because at the moment, the mobile phone sector is not built circular from the beginning. So we're trying to, remembering at Vodafone, we don't actually produce phones, we sell other people's phones. So we're trying within Vodafone to I guess in a way retrofit circularity onto this industry. And the best way for us to start doing that is to collect a scaled supply of high quality old phones, and see then what are the challenges and the barriers around refurbishing them and reselling them. So do pop into Vodafone shop if you want to take part in our kind of old phone amnesty. And we're also sort of piloting and experimenting with how we might be able to, once we've created a high quality supply of refurbished phones, how might we be able to use those phones to plug some of the gaps we have in our Africa markets, where there is a real shortage of supply of 4 and 5G phones for people. And we know that's the biggest barrier to accessing the internet across a number of those markets. So lots to experiment with. And then the final thing I'll say is we're also working, or have been working for a number of years, on something called Eco Rating, which is a cross-industry collaboration, and it provides a rating of a number of environmental factors for many different phones in our catalogue. So this is the kind of empowers consumers to be able to compare phones with a standardised set of data. So when they come into our stores or go online to buy their new phone, they can take climate considerations into consideration with their purchasing decision.
Amazing, Bobby. Yeah, lots of stuff there. And I think, as you say, everybody's got a phone, if not 2, probably on their desk. And I think maybe you've been in my office, looking in my office drawer, and I've seen the 6 or 7 OMO phones that might be sitting there. Thank you so much. There's definitely interest in this pilot program with these suppliers, so and CDP and everything. So please do. I know people would love to know a bit more about that. But Theo, I'm going to come to you and now about living wages. There's a number of different questions, so I'm going to try and encompassing them, couple them together. And really, I guess the overarching question is, how are you encouraging your suppliers, especially in countries where there's not a defined living wage, to really commit to paying at least a living wage to every worker in their operations that feeds into your operations? And I get people interested, like how you're approaching it. How are you actually going about engaging the suppliers on a really practical basis?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it's, I mean, to be honest, we launched the target in 2021, right? So I think it's a work in progress in a way. We are doing, we're working with, I guess, about 400 or so suppliers on a kind of tailored, tailored guidance on actually achieving living wages. So how we can, as I mentioned a little bit, that capability building piece, we're working on first the difference between minimum wage and living wage, understanding what a living wage is, and also the benefits, right? So why should a company pay a living wage? beyond the kind of obvious human impact reason, what is the potential impact on their business, and what kind of positives can they draw out of that. So I think there's an element there around, around building that understanding, around building the case for I guess changing the narrative around living wage as a cost, but rather as an investment. And the third thing for me is, in countries where there is no minimum wage, or where minimum wage is very low, we're working a lot with, so we have sustainability leads in certain countries like Brazil, China, Vietnam, Philippines, etc., who are working to essentially try and build that movement within the country. So working to, I guess, identify like-minded companies, build some sort of coalition, or work with UN Global Compact, for example, local chapters. We know there's a lot of local chapters in those countries that bring together businesses. So, leveraging those to bring a united voice on the issue, I think is another way to, to then approach government as a kind of group of companies. And that's something that we see a lot happen in the EU. We saw that with the EU legislation, for example. I think it was 60 or so companies had signed a letter asking for the EU to include living wage and living income in the latest due diligence legislation. If we're able to, build similar movements in countries like the Philippines or Vietnam, where we have this kind of critical mass of companies that are committing to the issue and united behind certain principles, that's how we kind of get the conversation going, I guess. And that can be both minimum wage, either setting minimum wage, raising minimum wage to be closer to living wage, or it can also just be that pushing governments to invest in making the cost of living lower, right? So it would be subsidizing education, healthcare, those kind of basics. And then I think just the last point is around the role of the ILO, right? So we know that the ILO is a trusted kind of global entity, and having them take a position and be a leader in the space, again, brings that kind of level of credibility and attention to the issue.
Amazing. Matteo, there's so much there. And I mean, certainly as you were presenting, I was scribbling lots of different notes. And you said, I think if I'm correct, you said one of the first things is looking at maybe, well, you said 400 suppliers. Is that kind of like your top 400 suppliers? Because Bobby, this is a question for you as well. You said you're focusing on those kind of top 4, and that's definitely an approach that a lot of firms take. Like, right, let's sort our own house out, and then let's target our top ones. But if I, as I say, as I shared at the beginning, I've got quite a lens on SMEs. They're often the big tailspin that's there in all of these global value chains. But tell me a bit more, and just briefly on both topics, how you're engaging or really supporting, I think, SMEs in these areas. Now, I realize they're both big questions, but I don't know if you've just got a couple of pointers on the SME lens, both for Bobby for Scope 3 and Matteo for the living wage. But Bobby, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. So, I mean, just start by saying SMEs are, as you said, like hugely important to our economies across both Europe and our African markets. We have launched something called VHub, which is basically a digital advice service for SMEs. It connects SMEs and SOHOs to experts who can provide advice about how to actually go through a digitization journey as an SME. We've got about 5.5 million people visiting VHub across our 14 markets, and we not all of those are in our supply chain. I mean, to be honest, expecting an SME to provide Scope 3 data within your supply chain, I think will be wholly unfair at this point in time. So we haven't got down to that level, but through some of the sort of engagements that we're doing with our SMEs around digital, we hope that we can also inform them on some of these climate issues as well. We have also support programs in place for the SMEs in the supply chain around optional financing across our African markets. We built a platform where SMEs called Vodatrade, where SMEs can connect to larger businesses through this digital platform that they may not have access to otherwise. So lots of support there, but I think how we actually bring SMEs along on this journey is still an emerging issue, and it's one that when I look at some of the regulation that's coming out for businesses across Europe on ESG. I know there's a lot of proposals, for example, to remove SMEs from the CSRD at European level, which is a huge new reporting directive. And I hope that is the case, because I think it would put a really undue burden on SMEs if not.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, working with SMEs every day, we want stuff to be really practical. And indeed, as a plea to all of you who are representing large firms, to have very similar asks going out to your smaller suppliers, so they're only filling out one kind of similar set. That's one of my own passion projects that I'd love to see, that something in the supply chain piece, that something's really, a set of questions that are agreed by everyone, all the big players, so the smaller ones only answer one set. It's a wish list, and that's fine. What Matteo, what about on the living wage piece? And again, you're obviously working with suppliers all around the world in lots of different countries, but just a couple of comments on the SME piece. And
sure, of course, happy to. So I guess there's two things. So Unilever has 52,000 suppliers, right? So when I mentioned kind of the key suppliers, it's not really only top suppliers. I think some of them are by spend. Some of them are by just looking at like high risk areas. And I think the idea, so the commitment actually applies to all 52,000 suppliers. We would hope that by 2030 they all do pay a living wage. The work that we're doing at the moment on capability building is really just starting with these kind of key suppliers, and then leveraging those lessons with the idea to be able to kind of scale that and help and support those. I guess the tail end of the supply chain, if you can say. That's one part. I think the second part is that we actually have another commitment which is focused on helping 5 million SMEs grow their business by 2025. And maybe similar to Bobby, I think it's access it would be access to finance, skills, or even digital platforms, etc., to help them with that. So there's a few platforms as well that are tied into, for example, if they work with Unilever, they could do digital ordering and management of stock, etc., to make it easier for them, lower cost, and essentially be able to help them grow at the same time. So I think it's probably a bit of both. So first, being able to make sure that they are in a stage where they are able to grow their business, and the second is trying to get that capability building, making sure that we can help them get to a living wage in a cost-effective way, I guess. Is that kind of phased living wage implementation approach.
No, fantastic. And I think it's equipping, well, all suppliers, but certainly smaller ones to be able to, there's lots of questions. Some of them are quite specific, but I'm going to come to, because unbelievably, there's only literally about 5 minutes left on the discussion, which is really some of your, again, it's kind of encompassing some of the questions there around really how you are advising or engaging or share some of the best strategies you've seen and the practical methods to really onboard your kind of your suppliers into, say, a sustainability and ESG framework. So, for example, a few minutes ago, I mentioned about having one platform that everybody uses. I know that we often hear a lot of firms talking about EcoVadis, and actually all suppliers put their data into there, and that's one platform. I know the others. But if you've got any of your top tips for people listening in today around kind of, these are the 2 or 3 key things that we would recommend that you have to do. Bobby, I'm going to come to you.
Thanks. So, well, I would also love it if there was one platform. That would be great, because remembering that, of course, as a business, we're also a supplier to many corporates around the world. So we also feel sometimes, I guess, the pain of the many different disclosures and frameworks that the different businesses use. So I think harmonization would be brilliant. I think one tip I'd give is working across industry is really, really helpful. So we've worked closely with the GSMA, which represents the mobile industry, and the ITU on some of their frameworks around Scope 3, knowing that we share as telecom companies a lot of the same suppliers, and the ones that we do share are probably the biggest contributors to our emissions. So I think, collaborate with your competitors. I was very happy, I don't know if it was earlier this week or last week, that the CMA published new guidelines in the UK saying, we shouldn't be worried about competition issues when we're collaborating to solve issues around the climate emergency, which I thought was a really, really brilliant steer to businesses to say, actually go forth and work together on these issues. So I think collaborate with your partners. I'm sure that, even listening to Matteo, and we work in very different industries, we share lots of the same challenges. So having these conversations with similar businesses will be really, really helpful. And then getting to a point where you can share data would be brilliant.
Yeah, and I really echo that, a collaboration piece. I know I touched on briefly at the very beginning. I spent many years working in the supply chain inclusion space around supplier diversity, and it's definitely an area where businesses collaborate who might not normally sit around the table, but actually if they're identifying really brilliant, diverse suppliers that they can use, then if they're able, multiple businesses to be able to work with them and help them grow, and then they're not sitting, they're not just working with one client, but actually they're working with multiple ones. So it's definitely, and I think for the climate and the planet, absolutely, we all need everything, needs to work towards that. Matteo, what about from your perspective and from a Unilever perspective, some of the 2 or 3 top tips that you're like, yeah, this is, if you're not doing anything, do this. Not necessarily just about living wage, but if there's maybe other things that you see your colleagues working on across the wider business.
It's a good question. I mean, I guess the way that we've organized our kind of sustainability strategy is around 3 pillars, right? And so it's on the climate and nature agenda, the health and well-being agenda, and the social agenda. So that's kind of equity, diversity, inclusion, living standards, and future of work. I guess it all kind of starts with a little bit of materiality assessment, right? So understanding what are the issues that are kind of relevant for you as a business, and how do they kind of play out in your supply chain, and what are the issues also that you're getting pressure from, for example, from NGOs or from investors or from others. What's important to all your stakeholders, consumers, obviously for Unilever, a big piece of the puzzle there. I think so it's a little bit of a bottom up and to an extent a top down approach. At some point you have to set a global strategy and try and bring that down. So I mean, for me, the as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's 3 big challenges. It's that kind of the climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and rising inequality. And I think being able to leverage external frameworks that are out there, such as by the Business Commission to Tackle Inequality, and I'm sure there's many equivalents on the climate space, as kind of a way to start without having to reinvent the wheel, right? I think that's quite important to be able to make sure that we do have similar asks, at least to an extent. And I think Bobby's point as well, very valid, being able to collaborate in a pre-competitive way, and align as best as possible our asks to others, I think is absolutely critical.
Yeah, thank you. And it is, I mean, I mean, even the fact that all of you have joined this session today shows that you are interested in collaborating and learning from each other. This isn't the kind of issue that's going to be sorted out in just a few months' time. It definitely is, it is one for the long term. We have reached time. I'm going to say, I hope this afternoon that you've heard some really practical and useful insights from both Bobby and Matteo, different ideas that you can take away. It is clear. I mean, it's always been clear there isn't a one size fits all. Bobby, I like to say there's not a silver bullet. Definitely try things out, and I think that's okay, because something that might work here in the UK is going to be completely different if you're working with suppliers in, I think you mentioned Brazil and different places like that, or in Africa. But really, consider whether, from my perspective, like working in collaboration with them, I know there was a piece around sometimes you want to get your own house in order before you start, but actually I think there's also a lot that can be said by working in partnership and getting going together and being real open about working on a journey together. And I think there's a lot to be said. A lot of said for that. And I think this whole idea, if you're introducing new ways of working or new demands on suppliers, making sure that you're providing that support for them, whether they're big or whether they're small and they need a bit of hand-holding. But whatever you do, Bobby and Matteo and I talked about this before, and whatever you do something as you come out of the end of, if you're joining for the whole summit, as you come out of the summit, do something, take some action. And certainly on the topic of this panel, to really engage and collaborate with your suppliers on these key sustainability challenges. They'll be different depending on what you're working on, but really to ensure that we're all working to embed that supply chain resilience. There is a ton of support available. I've seen lots of things in the chat. And I know, for example, even again with an SME lens, there's some great free resources on the Heart of the City website for SMEs. Point there. There's lots of different reports and resources that have been come out from both Vodafone and from Unilever. Again, they're all in the chat. Please do have a look at them. And there's so much brilliant support available within the Global Compact Network UK. So please check out. You do not need to do any of this alone or on your own. Definitely not. So a big thank you goes to Bobby and Matteo for presenting and sharing your insight this afternoon. I hope it's proved helpful. I hope it's been a bit thought-provoking. I can see lots of questions and lots of chats. So thank you, everybody, for being so engaging. Steve, I'm going to pass back to you now, but thank you very much, everyone, for listening in. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Great job. And Bobby and Matteo, thank you so much for giving us your time and your wisdom. Fabulous session, really, exactly as you said, Maggie. It's so important that we're engaging supply chains on this journey, and these are two really key areas, and your practical insights are invaluable. Thanks also, of course, to our audience for all your questions, and for being so engaged, again, as always. Next session, the final of the day and of the summit, is coming up in 10 minutes. We'll be reconvening at 3:20 British Summer Time. The session, Disrupting ESG as Usual, and we'll be looking at AI and how artificial intelligence can impact ESG performance, a big emerging issue, I think, one that we're hearing so much about. It's not so clear that many of us are using it yet, but it does feel like something we should be having a conversation about. After that, we're going to have a final closing remarks from Sanda Ojiambo via video, but nonetheless, our global UN Global Compact Executive Director. So do please stick with us for that. So please see you back again at 20 past. Enjoy your cup of tea and coffee refills. Thanks again to our speakers, and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thanks for having us.
Does intervention at the end as a session, but still looking forward to having that. So hi everyone, if you're just joining, I'm Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. We've been bringing a couple of days of programming your way. If you missed any of the sessions so far today or yesterday, we will be making recordings available via our website. So we do look forward to sharing that with you in the coming days. Just a bit of a housekeeping recap. Participants on the call are going to be muted and cameras off throughout, but we do want to hear from you. There'll be 2 channels for you to engage with us. The chat function is there for you to chat. So if you want to comment on anything you're hearing, if you want to share your LinkedIn profile, here's mine. if you want to just say hello, that's the place to do it. If you're having any technical difficulties, then please do let us know there, and we'll do what we can to sort you out. But do not post questions for our speakers in the chat box, because they won't be answered, and we can't move them over to the Q&A box. Zoom doesn't allow it. If you want to pose a question to our speakers, then please, there's a button at the bottom of your screen for Q&A, and that's the place to put it. And then also, please help us out. Keep an eye on the Q&A box, and if you see a question there that you're keen to have answered, then give it a thumbs up. We'll be looking at which questions are getting the most votes, and we will prioritize answering those. All day long, we've had more questions than we've had time to answer. So your help in prioritizing is really valuable to us. Okay, now this session is going to be a little bit shorter than some of the previous ones. So also a little bit of pressure on you to don't delay, get your questions in early, because we won't have as much time to deal with them. The last session of the day, we're going to be looking at, and I think to me anyways, and maybe our expert speakers will correct me on this, but it sure feels like an emerging issue, or at least a rapidly accelerating one. Obviously, AI has been around for a while, but it's over the last few months has really taken on new importance. And we want to explore how it's impacting ESG and how we can mitigate some of the associated risks of machine learning technology. As you see on this slide, as I've been saying all day long, SDGs are really critical to us, and we see this conversation impacting potentially on Goal 8, on Goal 9, on Goal 10, and Goal 13. But of course, the goals are so interconnected, it's going to have an impact on all of them, and maybe especially Goal 17 on partnerships. So we're short of time. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand over to Matthew Evans, Director of Markets at Tech UK. He's going to moderate this session, and he will introduce our speakers and get things going. Matthew, over to you.
Steve, thanks very much for that introduction. As Steve mentioned, I'm Matt Evans. I'm Director for Markets at Tech UK, and I'll be moderating today's panel on Disrupting ESG as usual, where we're really hoping to dive into whether or not artificial intelligence, or AI, can help companies enhance their ESG performance. So just a quick bit on who Tech UK is. We're the trade association which brings together people, companies and organizations to help realize the positive outcomes of what digital technology can achieve. We have around 1,000 members, the majority of which are SMEs, right across the UK. And we create a network for innovation and collaboration across business, government and stakeholders to provide a better future for people, society, the economy, and of relevance today, the planet as well. Now, we know that today that delivering ambitious sustainability goals in line with investor and regulatory expectations relies on continuous technological innovation. And today's discussion will focus on exploring how AI impacts that. Now, as Steve said, AI has been around for a while. If you're a technologist, you are probably sitting here in 2023 thinking, but this has been around for years. You know, there's little new here. And it might sound odd me saying this as a representative for the tech sector, but we absolutely love a fashion trend in the tech sector. And without doubt, we are in somewhat of an AI hype bubble at the moment. But, and there is of course a but coming, hype aside, it does seem to me that the introduction of large language models married with some of the natural language applications that we're starting to see in particular are helping to drive the adoption of those AI tools that have been around a while in a way that we haven't seen before, and represent a genuine inflection point in terms of their uptake. And indeed, you only have to look at the stock market to understand which companies have a compelling AI implementation story and those that do not. It is quite simply a burning platform issue in boardrooms across the world. So it's really timely, I think, to have today's discussion. When we look at AI within the context of ESG, and what we're hoping to dive into today, and obviously we want your questions as well, are the opportunities that we're looking to embrace in that area, and what challenges are we looking to tackle as well. So 2 big opportunities from me, which I know we've covered a little bit today as well. One is that digital technology can help cut carbon emissions by up to 20% if applied across the heaviest emitting sectors. This isn't just AI, it's also advanced telecoms networks, analytics, edge computing, but there's a huge emission saving opportunity that we can drive through the efficiency that AI can bring. Another big opportunity is really focused around ESG as a concept itself. Companies are going to face an avalanche of information requests, of data that they're going to need to capture, manage, interrogate, and derive actions from. And you can start to see some of those reporting requirements come out in regulatory regimes, when, for instance, on Task Force on Climate-Related Finance Disclosures, TCFD regime. And that is going to be a big opportunity for AI to help us with. What about some of the challenges which we'll get into? Well, AI needs that foundational technology in place to work. So it needs that good data set, also needs fundamentals like good cybersecurity, but it also needs greater understanding of how algorithms arrive at a certain position or decision. So what's under the bonnet really is key. And firms also need the right skills in place, so it isn't deployed poorly, or it isn't a waste of money in terms of its providing insights which aren't actioned. As is also, of course, the energy impact and the carbon emissions of AI itself. It's an underdeveloped area in terms of research because of how sort of on the edge some of these things are, but we don't know how much energy is being used to train frontier AI models or even large language models themselves. I anticipate that will be a big area of research over the coming years. Finally, AI can only really help if your sustainability strategy is in a good place too. Paying for a solution and assuming it will improve your supply chain transparency or lower emissions or improve governance will only work if companies have the structure, the board oversight, the teams and the targets to measure progress against. So hopefully that tees up what we're going to get into today. And indeed, let's go even further than what I've already listed. And rather than listen to me, I am very much a generalist and a history graduate, so I'm always careful when speaking about AI. We have some real specialists with us today in the form of Tess Buckley, who is AI Ethics Senior Analyst at Ethics Answer, and Lydia Hopton, who's Delivery Manager, Responsible Tech and Human Rights at BT. So Tess, hopefully we're going to come over to you first.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction and having me today. I'm very excited to talk with all of you about AI as an ESG issue. I hope the last 2 days have afforded lots of conversation. It's what I value most in life, so jumping into it. I think framing AI in terms of ESG is useful because ESG is all about non-balance sheets, non-balance sheet risks and liabilities that organizations face, and thus investors are also exposed to. And just like any other balance sheet where there are assets and liabilities, an AI system is potentially an asset for an organization, but equally can be a liability. So AI governance very much falls into the ESG area. There are other people who are focused on climate risks or decarbonization or biodiversity, and those are incredible and very important topics. I just so happen to focus on a very different niche of ESG, which not many other people cover, which is corporate digital responsibility and AI ethics. So I'm bringing light to the question of how well aligned organizations are to their stakeholder values, how well they're executing on what their stakeholders are saying is important. Trust within technology is so important these days. We could build the best technology in the world, but if we are not willing to find ways to get our audiences to trust it and take it on, it's really the EU. And I'm hoping for the Brussels effects here. I'm hoping that it will be a start and there will be just a domino effect across the board. But we also have a lot of soft law in AI to consider, frameworks and standards. And I'll point out a useful piece that was released by the EU Commission called Ethics by Design. That was from 2021. So AI and digital governance are big ESG issues, but I feel that they've been thus far neglected in broader ESG discourse. However, recent advances in AI, one might say ChatGPT exploding into the mainstream has seen AI and ESG kind of simultaneously gaining increasing share of limelight in public discourse. But despite this kind of concurrent growth, digital risks remain frustratingly divorced from the broader ESG discourse. I find when I'm looking at sustainability reports, I would be lucky to see a mention of digitalization and AI risks in the typical corporate. So I'm hoping for changes and more spotlights in the upcoming years, because digital technology is pervading every industry, with digital transformations leading to further automation of businesses in all sectors. Whilst digitalization does promise a lot of opportunity for our society and our environment, as noted by Matthew, it also brings a multitude of risks, and that requires strong mitigation through digital governance frameworks and ESG strategy. So while I was preparing for this talk, I thought, why is AI not included in the ESG agenda, or why might it be needed to bring kind of more forefront? And I think a primary reason for this might be that there's a misconception that digital risk concerns are largely confined to companies whose offers are explicitly digital. And so that might be big companies such as Microsoft or Google or Amazon. Yet as we're seeing, digital technologies are reshaping businesses, business models of industries we wouldn't historically associate with digital technologies. With real world issues exemplified in agricultural service industries, the impact of digitalization is widespread. In agriculture, we're seeing AI-enabled precision tools, which could help reduce food waste and protect crop yields for farmers. However, if this integration is not met with strong digital governance principles, it could actually perpetuate the competitive advantage of large-scale farmers who are better placed to scale using technology. And these digital risks of lack of operation autonomy for farmers was actually highlighted in a lawsuit in 2022, which was basically filed against a big manufacturer because their software was deliberately impossible for the farmers to repair themselves. They had to go to the manufacturer. To list a few examples of AI's impact on the environment, we can consider emissions intensity, energy usage, environmental operations. Examples could be seen in that Google found that AI made up 15% of the company's total electricity consumption. On the social side, I always say robots are not going to fix the problems we cannot ourselves. They're simply going to amplify them at scale. So I talk a lot about bias, ableism, and biotechnologies. We have a lot of human rights. There was thousands of parents falsely accused of fraud by a Dutch tax authority, global health and safety, Kenyan workers being paid less than 20 cents per hour US dollars to make ChatGPT less toxic. And finally, government, data reporting, disclosure practices, examples of increased bias in hiring, who is responsible when someone goes wrong. And now that I've listed all these issues, I'll get to now what? AI governance as an ESG strategy. So with AI propelling itself, deep into the mainstream and ESG benchmarking growing as a means of informing socially conscious investors and users, this, I think, could be the first sign of a perfect storm for poorly governed tech companies. I work with investors and portfolio managers that are increasingly scrutinizing the ESG impacts of digital technologies to inform their investment decisions and putting pressure on companies from all industries to consider the corporate digital responsibility as part of their ESG strategy. I'm hoping that ESG strategies and should account for digital technology in 2023 and 2024. Choosing to implement these digital ESG strategies is, yes, at this point, a commercial decision, but with government action and AI policy right around the corner, we have the National AI Safety Summit and we've got the AI Act. It's highlighting digital ethics as a priority. I see the note in the chat that my time is coming to a close, so I'll just jump to the final bit here as I'm excited about this topic. But I see this as a great opportunity to share, and I hope it's come across in my talk, the sense of urgency to take action that ensures that the AI you're using or developing is fundamentally ethical and sustainable. So thank you so much for your ears and attention today. I'm looking forward to upcoming panelists and later Q&A discussions.
Wonderful, thanks Tess. And I think you've given us a really sort of, broad sweep in terms of the issues taking place there as well. Lydia, can we come over to you, please? Just as we wait for... We can hear you, Lydia, yeah?
Yeah.
Can't see you yet.
Here we go. Great.
Perfect. Hi.
Perfect. So thanks for having me here today to discuss with you AI and share BT Group's perspective. We're obviously in the graveyard shift after a really exciting 2 days of conference, and I hope that we can keep your attention for a little bit longer, because I think it's a super important topic. And it's going to touch all of us in our work lives and our personal. So for those of you who don't know BT, we can trace our roots all the way back to the Electric Telegraph Company in 1846. So we're the oldest communication company in the world. And today we provide fixed and mobile telecommunications and related digital products to a global customer base in 180 countries through our brands of BT Business, EE and PlusNet. So we're a big business, we're 100,000 colleagues, and we're all over the world. And I think it's important to point out and kind of support Hugh's point here that when we talk about artificial intelligence, we're not talking about a new technology. And the foundations were laid way back in the 1940s. World War II was still underway when a mathematical model of neural network was created, which became fundamental to AI research. That being said, I do think, as already has been said by Matthew, that we're in a new phase and we'd be remiss not to acknowledge that. And my colleague recently described it as the glitzy Hollywood phase. AI has become democratized, we can all access it directly on our own devices, and it's increasingly integrated into day-to-day applications. So, for example, we use it, EE, use it to provide anti-spam filters on scam texts every week. So every week that AI-powered solution stops 252 million scam texts on the network. There's less serious applications of it, so using Gen AI to write a brief history of time or create an image of Darth Vader ice fishing. Two things I'm proud to admit that I have done. But it has real potential in the world of ESG, which I think I'll come on to. But I do think there's a point here, and it's potentially to kind of maybe calm people who are feeling anxious about the speed at which things are changing, that AI is a marathon and it's not a sprint. So back in kind of the 1980s, BT developed a job scheduling system for our engineers. And we also developed the world's first instantaneous translation of speech by a computer. So we could translate to European languages and Japanese way back in the 80s. In 2012, we used our AI tools to support the London Olympics, reduced their communication network equipment demand by 10%. So that had a really great impact on their environmental reduction and also cost, and supported the overall gains being the greenest year. And that more recently in 2022, we launched an AI accelerator to reduce time to launch of AI solutions from 6 months to 6 days. And this was a partnership platform. So it was BT, Datatonic and Google Cloud. So it's not new, but it is increasingly available. And what I'm going to come on to now is a few ways that I think it can support ESG, and I'll use some BT examples within there. And I think I'll also come on to how, because I think it's the how is so important of how we get it right and we minimize the risk of harms. So I think the first opportunity is around data analysis and prediction. So AI can analyze vast amount of data, identify patterns and trends related to environmental impact, social responsibility and corporate governance. It can provide predictive analytics to help us anticipate future challenges, and it can really help us make data-driven decisions. And I think in ESG, we can apply it to everything from waste management to climate risk assessments of property portfolios. Like there's loads that can be done. And I'm already seeing kind of in my day job, less time spent in spreadsheets, analysing data, more time using tools that kind of buy me time to get on with kind of the strategy and the implementation that will reduce business impact. I do think it's important, though, to put a health warning here that for applications, AI needs data, right? Data is the fuel to AI. And AI relies on good data going in to get good outputs from the solution. And that's through all of these applications. Got to have good data going in. The second opportunity area is in supply chain transparency. So supply chains are super complex. At BT, we have 10,000 direct suppliers in nearly 100 countries. And last year we spent over 15 billion on everything from pencils to phones. So it's vast. We're committed to ethical standards in our supply chain, which is all good stuff. But to actually do that and bring it to life, we need to find that supply chain. We need to find the supply chain beyond the people that we pay directly at tier 1. And we've used AI to help us do this. So we focused on our branded products. So BT only sources branded products from 11 direct suppliers, a really tiny population within that 10,000 supplier group. So it's not many. And we used Burst AI, which was spun out of Cambridge University, to map these supply chains based on publicly available information. And it was really incredible what we learned. So we found that there were 600 indirect suppliers supporting the 11 direct suppliers. And that within the 600 indirect suppliers, there were 1,800 supplier relationships across tiers 2, 3, and 4. And some of the suppliers appeared over 20 times. So they were really of strategic importance to our supply chain. A traditional mapping exercise, which I did kind of about 10 years ago on a light, takes months. And it involves many supplier surveys and desktop research to gather and analyze data. And it provides a limited one-off snapshot of a product supply chain. And honestly, by the time you've got to the end of the analysis, like it's already out of date. So the advantages of this approach are the live nature of the outputs and the speed. And by having the visibility, we're able to prioritize our engagement in higher risk markets from a human rights perspective, and also products. The health warning on this is that there are limitations to the accuracy of the findings. So Burst AI relies on publicly available information. This isn't always up to date, and language translations aren't perfect. So it is important to validate the findings. But AI gets us 80% of the way in a much, much shorter time. So it's a starting point that we can build off. And then I think the third opportunity area is around energy efficiency. So buildings are responsible for about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. consuming at least 30% of energy globally. And smart and sustainable buildings are on the rise as they present a key opportunity to meet climate targets. And AI-powered systems can optimize energy consumption. BT's collaborated with a company called Johnson Controls, who offer a platform called OpenBlue. And this platform helps business customers in the UK and internationally benefit from smart building technology to optimize energy in the workplace. And it can be applied in a factory, it can be applied in an office, it can be kind of applied in all sorts of work settings. And the way that this has been described to me is that the AI helps the building management system see. So it gives it eyes. So for example, if there hadn't been any movement on level 14 of your office for a period of time, it can optimize the heating and cooling accordingly. And it can learn patterns of occupancy. So it can understand like, what's the, when do people normally get there on a Monday? When do they leave on a Friday? Kind of, and adjust the heating and cooling when nobody's there. This collaboration will help us at BT help our customers avoid around 60 million tonnes of CO2 by the end of March 2030, which will help our customers reach their net zero targets further. So I think this is a really kind of great energy efficiency piece. But I want to come on to how we do this, and I think responsibility is the priority. So at BT Group, we want to be the most trusted connector of people, devices and machines, and taking a responsible approach to tech. It's both the right thing to do and it's good for business. So building trust is needed to accelerate adoption and growth of tech. All businesses need to mitigate risk from AI tools, which requires, we believe at BT, involving humans in final decisions. So our formula for success is humans plus AI, and that will really help us. But we need robust guardrails and governance around that. And at BT, we do that through 4 simple principles. For good, making sure we're not just developing tech for tech's sake. Accountable, thinking about all of the unintended consequences and knowing that things can go wrong, but that we will put it right. Fair is our 3rd principle, making sure what we do benefits everyone inclusively and accessibly. And our 4th principle is open, which is about listening to our customers, collaborating in design and being transparent. And we've applied these principles to AI to form ethical guardrails, ensuring transparency and accountability and data privacy at all stages of the value chain. So whether we're developing, using, buying or selling AI, we can apply the responsible AI principles. And to ensure that the principles are put into practice, we've developed policies and processes. We've got expert people and we've got strong governance led by an ex-co-chaired steering group. So we've really got support from the top of our business, as well as kind of pushing up through more traditional policies and processes. And I think my conclusion here is that AI isn't the responsibility of one part of a business. It really will take a collaborative, cross-cutting approach to get it right. But that AI evolution is happening. It's happening very quickly at the moment. As a business, we're committed to a responsible approach, and we will continue to do this through processes, engagement with people, and practical experimentation, all underpinned by the responsible tech principles. That's everything I had to share, Matthew.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Lydia. And you've definitely stirred some thoughts in the chat. And just a reminder for all of our attendees, please do drop a question into the Q&A box as well. Now, Lydia, it feels a bit harsh to ask you this question because I think you've given us quite a few, but one that has got a lot of a pickup at the moment in the chat box was, can you share practical examples of using AI in ESG strategy? Now, I know you talked a lot about supply chain management and things like that. One thing that did come up in the sort of in the chat rather than the questions was sort of how SMEs can make use of AI in complying with their own ESG sort of requirements. And I wonder, Lydia, I think you said 10,000 companies or suppliers to BT in 100 different countries. I guess sort of anything you could touch on in terms of how you engage with those suppliers would be great in terms of getting that data that you need, but also helping them on their journey as well, I guess.
Yeah, so we're on a journey and we don't have all of the answers, but I'm happy to share our plan. And it comes with kind of that limitation on it. It's a plan. So we've got our responsible tech principles. From that, we will be building a responsible AI standard. And from that, we'll have various checklists and guidance documents. And so we will be developing one of those specific for our supply chain. So if a supplier is providing an AI solution to us, we'll be asking them to answer certain questions in a nutshell so that we can be confident that we can trust the solution that we are buying from them. You know, that it has been designed in the right way, that it has the right governance around it, that it's not going to kind of perpetuate biases, for example. So that's kind of our plan, and where we find suppliers that potentially don't have the answers or haven't answered in a way that is aligned with our values, we will try and work with them to understand why, what could be improved, and how can we support them. So I think that's kind of how we plan to engage in the supply chain. In terms of kind of SMEs, I guess, specifically, and what they can do, I think it's all about proportionality of the risk of what those companies are providing. And so we've had recent examples of very small startups with, you know, solutions to us, but they're unable to provide any documentation around their model that underpins their solution. And at the moment, we can't be confident in how that has been built, how it's been tested, how it's learning. And so we can give guidance back to say this is what we would be looking for to be confident. Come back to us, you know, almost when you've got that confidence in your own product.
Great, thanks, Lydia. Tess, I don't know if you wanted to come in on those points in terms of AI in terms of ESG, but there's one which there's another question which we can jump to if you would like as well, which is really around how companies and organizations can demystify the language surrounding AI to ensure transparency and understanding for key stakeholders. I think I'll take that one.
I'll jump into that one. I'm a big fan of AI literacy training, and so I'm happy to speak to that. I think it starts with just knowing that there's no shame in admitting that you might not know what AI is, and you might have to take stock of how your company is using it. Asking questions like, you know, what training and upskilling is required on both the junior and the director level. Education is so important here, seeking expert knowledge to navigate this ever-evolving landscape, and really working to address the information gap between the makers and the users of technology. But a lot of the time I ask that people look in-house first. So try and get your tech teams to translate what they're doing to your content and strategy teams, and then ask your content and strategy teams to translate that to the public. Right now, I work for a nonprofit that's focused specifically on AI literacy training for marginalized communities. And here we kind of work on closing the gap, the digital divide, I guess, between socioeconomic backgrounds, gender, race. And sometimes it does look like running that 1-hour workshop with your team. And I guess I'm sharing this to also consider things you can do on the ground, alongside things like looking at the use cases for AI systems you're hoping to integrate. When I say use cases, for example, if you're planning to use facial recognition technologies as a means to enter your building, creating an open forum where your employees can consider other ways that might be used, and then releasing a statement concluding how there's comfort and discomfort around it, and how you plan on moving forward with these bits. AI itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but the ways in which it can be used is. And so addressing the potential uses is another way to go about it.
Great, thanks, Tess. Amazingly, we're sort of running up against time already somehow. So just one final question from me to both of you. Given Tess just answered the last one, Lydia, I'll tee you up as sort of the recipient of this one, if that's all right. But obviously in the context of ESG, which itself is sort of quite a big topic area, do you sort of foresee a moment in time where maybe there's certain guardrails that companies might put around AI, or the governance structures that they put around, will actually feed into sort of that company's ESG rating at some point? And can you sort of see that being a sort of evolution in a way further down the path? And do you have any thoughts around that as well, really?
I think I can see how kind of a digital, like people's digital approach becomes measured in benchmarks, and AI being part of that. And I do think that kind of evolution of AI as it is happening today, and the way that the governance is being built in my business and how we're responding to that, is mirroring previous paths of kind of how we have responded to environmental risk, how we have responded to social risk in the supply chain. You know, it's very similar conversations, just with a kind of different topic. So I think, yes, I can see that kind of digital being an assessment and AI being part of that.
Great, thanks very much. Tess, coming over to you.
I do see already existing frameworks that we don't really need to reinvent the wheel. Leaning on the NIST AI risk framework, which is used in a lot of corporate America. You have the AI ISO AI management, the EU Act, and we actually have an AI standards hub coming out of the Alan Turing, which I think would be a great reference for people that want to better understand how AI governance might impact ESG. I think I can also see a future where there's a lot of bad news stories or PR stories around companies that made promises to SDG goals and ESG, but didn't necessarily consider the uses of AI and the impact of things like large language models and their uses. So I do worry about these news stories, and I hope that there are better ways to account for AI use or track generative AI use in employees. I think a key to this will be actually just transparency about AI implementation with disclosure of how you're using technologies, as we know that implementation of these technologies is somewhat essential to compete. Back to the key question. I do think that AI is really exciting, and although I'm an AI ethicist, I think that AI is something that needs to be considered alongside AI governance risk, but I ask people not to reinvent the wheel. So for instance, if you work in biotechnologies, there's a lot of work already around sensitive data and what it means to handle sensitive data. If you work in the financial industry, look into your auditing frameworks and see how those could maybe apply as well. I think the tech that will sustain is ethical tech. It's not going to get caught up in scandals. It's not going to get caught up in fines with governance. And so ethical technology aligned with AI governance that is a supporter of ESG issues and SDG goals will be essential for businesses moving forward.
Great, thanks, Tess. Well, Lydia, Tess, I think that's a great place to leave it. I'm sure we could have got into a lot more detail if we had a little bit more time, but hopefully for all of our participants, that was also a really rich conversation that covered both sort of the big stroke sort of strategic picture, but also some of the fantastic sort of direct applications that we are starting to see in the ESG space. I'm sure this is a conversation that will only continue to grow over the next 6 to 12 months. Steve, back to you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Tess. Thank you, Lydia. Absolutely right, Matt. I think that there's still so many questions, but you guys have helped us understand better the framework and the scope within which we're operating here, and certainly helping me a lot with just where I need to look next in terms of how we might integrate AI into the work that we're doing. So thank you very, very much. Again, thank you to the audience for your engagement. Great inputs there as well. And now it's over to me. We're on to our final wrapping up session for our annual summit. It's been a fantastic couple of days. Before I leave you with a final message from the global CEO of the UN Global Compact, Assistant Secretary General Sanda Ojiambo, I want to take a moment to reflect on some of the insights and the quality of discussions that we've had over the last 2 days. We've heard about delivering a fair and just transition to a net zero, nature positive future, demystifying and democratizing corporate governance, and how data and emerging technologies can support weaning off individual overconsumption. We've had thought-provoking deliberations on reshaping corporate finance, proactive social sustainability reporting, the importance of measurable, credible, and ambitious sustainability targets, and the fine line between bold ambition and greenwashing. We've had discussions on what businesses can do to promote diversity across their leadership teams, on the practical examples of how they can address climate change and nature loss as part of a unified transition strategy, as well as discussions on anti-corruption due diligence, supply chain resilience, and now artificial intelligence. In the middle of all that, we launched the UN Global Compact Network UK SDG Playbook for SMEs to help smaller companies overcome the main barriers impeding their progress to contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. Really just can't thank enough the many speakers that have contributed so generously to the program over the last couple of days. Of course, to all of our participants, really for us, a shocking number. We've had over 3,000 registrations and literally thousands of participants engaging. And I'm sure many more looking forward to following up with our recordings in the days ahead. We really appreciate all the contributions that our participants have made in the Q&As, in the chat, in person yesterday. The positive energy, both in person and online today, has been palpable. And I really hope that the ripple effects from the conversations that we've had are going to really generate some impact. I felt it was our intention all along to keep a focus on practical action all the way through. We wanted you to come away from every session with a couple of more items added to your job list, or at the very least, having triggered some ideas that you need to look into further. It's a time for leadership, so we need action on these ideas. With governments and other stakeholders, the private sector needs to be brave, see the SDGs as a driver for growth, a driver for better business. It remains the greatest catalyst for global action. The private sector has such an important role to play in creating the future we want. You can see on your screen, you might be thinking, as certainly crossed my mind after all the work we've done over the last 2 days, that we might just put our feet up until Christmas, but that is not the case. We have lots of fantastic programming coming up in the weeks ahead. There was some mention in this last session about more programming for SMEs, and we certainly share the view that it's really important. We've been running a series of webinars, an 11-part series of webinars on environmental sustainability for SMEs. Coming up on the 26th of October, we're going to have a quite focused session on implementing energy efficiency measures. We've got a session coming up on inclusion and occupational safety and health that I think is a really interesting perspective on this important issue area. We've got continuing our environmental Q&A surgery. We're doing a session on expectations for COP28. It's on the 21st of November, and I urge you to check that out to help you prepare yourself to better understand the news coming out of Dubai during the COP. For members only, well, and some of those are members only too, but if you're not a member already, you can see in the chat some links to get you there. Do please get in touch. We organize well over 100 events a year to help drive corporate sustainability, and we're confident that you can get some value from being a member. Key areas for us is our accelerator programs. SDG Ambition is a program to help you integrate the SDGs and to internalize the SDG goals for business benefit. Our Business and Human Rights Accelerator is going to help prepare your company for the emerging new regulations around human rights due diligence in supply chains that's coming. And our SDG Innovation Accelerator for young professionals is a really fantastic program for young people in your company to give them a breakthrough innovation mindset that will bring benefits to your company, and also, it's fantastic professional development. Before I hand over to Sanda, because we're going to end things promptly at the end of her intervention, I just have to extend again a huge thank you to the team. It's been a massive team effort to deliver the summit over the last 2 days. Everybody has contributed, but a particular shout out to Aaron Sharp and Lily Venables for the extraordinary leadership that they've shown in herding us all and keeping us all on target and delivering such a fantastic program. So I hope, Aaron and Lily, that you guys are feeling really proud of what we've achieved here. I'm certainly feeling really proud of it too. And so with that, we're going to hand over the floor to our esteemed leader from New York. She'll give us some parting words, and I'm just going to say thanks again so much for joining us. We look forward to working with you all again in the future, and I wish you a great afternoon wherever you are. Thank you.
Business leaders, colleagues, distinguished guests, it is a pleasure to speak to you today. I'd like to start by thanking the City of London Corporation and all of our event partners for making this summit possible. And I'd like to thank each one of you for contributing to this dynamic conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, this conversation comes at a critical time. As you all know too well, interconnected global crises, war, economic instability, and worsening climate change are threatening companies and communities worldwide. At the halfway point of the 2030 agenda, the world is no longer on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Recent stocktaking shows that, globally, only 15% of them are on track. Worse yet, progress on some 37% of SDGs has stalled or even been reversed. The world we want is quickly slipping out of our reach. And if we have learned anything over the last few years, it is that businesses cannot operate independently of their environments. CEOs from around the world report that the top challenges they face are existential or external to their work. Climate change, inflation, human rights, social justice, threats to public health, and trade issues are driving their perspectives, along with their customers' expectations, more than their business product itself. At the same time, according to our recent private sector stocktake, companies report a gap in the skills, technology, and reporting capabilities needed to make significant progress across the range of SDGs. And some 80% of CEOs say insufficient policy incentives slow their sustainability progress. These gaps have serious implications for people and the planet. For example, roughly a quarter of private sector revenue is still negatively aligned with climate action. Friends, These challenges can feel overwhelming, and yet the current crisis also presents an opportunity for businesses to transform themselves, meeting the needs of the future and positioning themselves on the cutting edge of global markets. We have seen examples of this transformative leadership in the ambitious commitments made by both countries and companies at the Secretary General's recent SDG Summit. But, ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that our current efforts are not enough. Global corporate commitments, and more importantly, corporate actions, are falling far short of the positive change that the world so desperately needs. That is why our newly launched Forward Faster initiative will focus on 5 key areas where the business community is best positioned to advance sustainable development: gender equality, climate action, living wage, water resilience, and SDG finance and investment. Participating companies will be asked to publicly commit to and track progress on ambitious business targets that advance all 17 SDGs. In turn, Forward Faster will provide vital opportunities for business, serving as a global platform for companies to showcase this progress and advocate for policy change. Chief financial officers can turn these ambitious commitments into investments, including through capital spending, human capital, research, development, and marketing. We invite all businesses to join this exciting new initiative. The road before us is challenging, but our growing and evolving corporate sustainability movement, more than 18,000 companies in more than 160 countries, is reason for optimism. We have seen firsthand that when companies join forces for the common good, great change is possible. Together, we can rescue the SDGs and build a more just and resilient world. Thank you.